Hello everyone. In this video I am going to demonstrate on how to make a simple bird of paradise painting using watercolor pencils. And I'm going to use these Faber-Castell student grade watercolor pencils. And just to let you all know, this is not a product review of Faber-Castell or any other watercolor pencils. It's just a simple tutorial, especially for beginners who are using watercolor pencils for the first time. And I'm going to demonstrate this painting on Canson's cold press watercolor paper of 300 grams per square meter thickness, and it is half of the A4 size, which is equivalent to A5 size. So previously I have demonstrated on the characteristics of a typical watercolor pencil against conventional watercolor paints, and if you'd like to check out that video, I'll leave the link in the description. So I have filtered out the basic colors that I will be using for this bird of paradise painting, and I have also prepared these particular colors in a form of color chart or palette for easy guidance, and I might skip one or two colors or add on additional colors. So a quick glance on how to make the color swatches from the coloring palette that I've made earlier, and it may also be helpful for your visualization, as in the type of color or the tones that I'm going to use as I go through this tutorial or painting process, because you may be using different color brands, so this is just a simple guidance for your visualization. In fact, if you're using your watercolor pencil for the first time, I would advise you to make similar color swatches for your easy reference as you start painting. So this is my basic sketch of the bird of paradise flower, and I made it based on a reference photo. You can get copyright free images from Pixabay. So I decided to kickstart this painting using yellow to serve as an underpainting. So I'm going to color the main stem that's holding the petals with yellow. You can use a light green shade instead. I just felt that there were some hints of yellow on the stem, so I thought I would like to maintain that yellowish tone in the stem while adding some brightness before I start layering with darker colors later on. So done with the first color, now I am going to just apply a hint of light orange as I showed from the chart earlier, just lightly making some scribbles on areas that I notice has some hint of orange. Alright, time for the magic wand to do the big work, which is my typical round brush. And to kickstart, I am not going to have a very soaked wet brush. It's just a damp brush. So just wet your brush and remove the excess water by damping it on paper towel, and just use the damp brush to activate those pigments that we have colored in, and see the magic happen. And if you still find your brush wet, as I said earlier, just use a paper towel to squeeze out the excess water. So basically, as I move my brush, there are no major brush strokes, but it is actually just gliding the bristle of the brush on the colored areas. So you don't have to worry too much about your brush strokes or brush control. It's quite minimal, and as long as the brush is not soaked wet, as in there's not too much water applied, then everything should be under control. So we'll leave that part to dry and move on to other part of the flower. Next, I'm extending the same yellow tone to the petals. So as usual, I'm kick-starting by just coloring those areas. And I have also speed up the coloring process, otherwise this entire tutorial is going to take very long to complete. Next, I'm using the same light orange that I used on the stem and extending it to the petals. And remember, the coloring process is supposed to be gentle, meaning you don't want to indent the paper surface by scribbling too hardly or applying too much pressure on the paper while you make the coloring. Otherwise, you will be having trouble making washes when you apply the wet brush, as well as the indent leaves marks where you can't repair or can't cover with more and more layers of color, because the indent has deeply marked the paper surface. Alright, time to wet them with the watercolor brush. So just a reminder, when you work using watercolor pencils, you don't really need fancy brushes or a certain type of brush, as long as they are good quality watercolor brushes. In fact, student grade from a professional brand works fine as well. The only thing that matters would be the size of your brush depending on the area of your work. So if you're working on a very narrow area of painting, then obviously you will need a smaller brush. So over here I am just attempting to color in the same orange pigment while the painting is still wet, just to see how it goes. Of course, it glides much easier when the paper surface is still wet. I will demonstrate further this process by pre-wetting the paper later on in this tutorial. So moving on to the next petals, I noticed that these two petals are of much darker tone, so I'm going to use a darker orange for this, paired with the same lighter orange that I applied earlier. So for this particular petal painting, I am pre-wetting the paper surface, as I mentioned earlier, just to show you what it looks like when you apply the color pencil onto the wet surface. As you can see, the colors seem to appear much darker, and it's much more easier to apply as it glides easily compared to applying a dry pigment onto a dry surface. And after applying the pencil onto the wet surface, I am quickly trying to blend them in using my damp brush. And now, while it's still wet, I am using the second color, which is the lighter orange shade. And as I said, it's quite evident that it glides very smoothly and quickly onto the wet surface. And I'm quickly blending in with my damp brush once again. And as you can see, I'm repeating the same process for the second petal, starting off by pre-wetting the paper surface and then just coloring in. And I'm also extending a red tone onto this petal. As I noticed from the reference photo, it looks much darker with a reddish hint. And a quick blend in with the damp brush. Alright, moving on to the purple tone petals. So I'm just using a lighter purple tone And now I am pairing it with indigo for the darker part of the purple petal. So since this petal is of very narrow shape, I decided to use a smaller brush. As I said, when it comes to working on a narrow place or fine lines, it's better to use a much more finer size brush. So basically we are done with the first layer painting. Now we are moving on into the second layer painting, and I'm going to kickstart by painting the stem of the petal. So kickstarting with a lighter shade of green and just coloring those areas. Done with the lighter green shade, now I am applying the darker green shade. So usually it is advisable to have a few shades or color variations in your painting so that the painting appears more natural and interesting. And since there are darker areas, or in other words shadow, on the bottom part of the petal stem, I have extended the indigo color, just minimal values for now, and let's see what happens when I apply the damp brush. Alright, time for the brush to do its work. So as I activate the pigment applied with the damp brush, you can see the colors moving. So at this point of time, you might want to be careful with your brush movements not to transfer those pigments to other areas that you don't wish to stain. And if you notice hard edges as a result of those pigment staining, just use damp brush to just soften those edges. So gently use a damp brush to just soften this area like what I'm doing now, and you'll achieve a smooth look. Moving on, time to repaint the petals. And I'm going to use the darker shade of orange, which is third from left. And since this is a second layer painting, you might want to focus on the dark and light areas of your painting. For example, you will have to make more darker shadings onto the areas where it is secluded from sunlight or natural light, and leave the areas that requires highlight so that it appears much brighter. Extending the same dark orange pigment to other petals as well. And at this point, I hope you could notice the colors on the stem that's holding the petal as a result of the underpainting that I did earlier. Due to the yellow color that I use as underpainting, before I start layering in all the other shades that varied from light green to darker green and indigo, I feel that the stem looks much more natural because it still has or maintains the yellowish hint on the stem. And if I would have painted it right away with a green shade as a first color, I am afraid it might appear too green and flat. You might think of applying yellow pigment at a later stage after applying green. However, do not forget that the yellow paint is still lighter than the green shade, so you might have difficulty to brighten the stem once. So the best to always work from lighter shades moving towards darker shades, just like in normal watercolor. So I'm going to extend the orange pigment now onto the stem itself. Just a little bit of scribbles here and there to add some extra character to the stem. A little bit of red wouldn't hurt as well. And once again, using my small brush to blend in those fine details. So, since the purple petal looks lighter, I am reapplying or recoloring the purple petals as well, using the same color combination, which is indigo and purple. And I've also decided to use an extra color as a reflection on those purple petal, which is a sky blue. Just a little scribble, and also extended it minimally onto the top part of the stem. And now just blending that with my smaller brush. Alright, time to fine tune the stem by adding more darker values. And I'm kickstarting with the darker shade of green. And once again, using the indigo for the darkest part of the stem. And I've also decided to add some brown, which has a golden hint, or I would call it yellow ochre, to some part of the stem. And once done with this yellow ochre, I am going to start blending those colors in. So since there are more pigment or color layering at this point of time, you don't want to make major brush strokes as I said earlier. You can just dab with your damp brush so that the pigments stay in their own area where they're supposed to show the color and not stain other part of the painting. So after further observation, I noticed that this particular red petal actually has a hint of shadow due to the purple petal which is behind it or beneath it. So I'm just using some darker shade of red paired with a dark brown to create the impression of this shadow, though it may not be too obvious on the screen. So to fine-tune the petals further, I have decided just to use the color pencils alone without activating them with water, meaning I am going to draw some fine lines onto the petals or some scribbles and leave it as a final touch. Extending the same technique without involving any water activation onto the other parts of the flower, which is the stem. I personally feel this technique makes your watercolor painting more radiant and as a wrap up of the entire painting process. So try it and see it for your own self. Now for the last step of fine tuning, I am going to use white color pigment to apply some highlights, and you can do this by wetting the tip of the white color pencil and just make the scribbles or draw onto the finished painting. Though I must say it's a bit difficult to show it on the screen, but try it, you can see the difference. And if you dislike the idea of dipping the pencil into water, then I would suggest you to pre-wet the surface of the painting or paper and then apply the white pigment. As I showed earlier in the earlier part of the painting process, it's much more easier to apply the color pencil pigment onto a wet surface. So I would say you can nail this for the white pigment. So basically we have come to the end of this bird of paradise painting. I'm just going to show you one final technique or approach on painting the background. So for those who are interested in painting backgrounds of the subject matter, then keep watching. In order to nail a good background, choose a color that complements the subject matter. Avoid colors that are similar to the subject, which can make the painting become flat or blended with the background. Try to avoid very dark colors that can steal the limelight of the subject. Use more than one color to add radiance in the background. However, learn to paint from light to dark shades. As I have mentioned, this is watercolor painting. You always start with a lighter shade and then moving towards darker shade as you progress in your painting. And also remember to work in layers if you can't decide or visualize the color of your painting. So once painting is dry, then you decide to use a new color as you progress. Learn to blend the colors well and do not leave patches or hard lines. Try to make gradient washes and soften hard edges for a smooth look. Get creative by adding some patterns or drawings onto your backgrounds, but keep it minimal. Last but not least, enjoy the entire painting process. And with this, we are done with the painting of the bird of paradise. And just a quick observation, I noticed that the highlights now look much brighter once the painting is dry. And as for those petals that are painted using the pre-wet technique, I realized that it doesn't look as smooth as the other part of the flower. So even though the color application was way much easier on the pre-wet surface, however, the result of the painting doesn't look so smooth. I mean, this is just my observation based on the type of watercolor pencils that I used. Could differ from brand to brand and type of watercolor pencils. So if you find this tutorial interesting and helpful, then don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support.